Welcome to another episode of Working the Word. This is our 13th in the series on the Gospel of John. And we're up to chapter 11 and just touching into 12.
Yeah, just the beginning.
We could call this the Lazarus episode.
We really could.
Because he gets sick, he dies, his family has to be comforted. And then Jesus brings him back to life, which leads to the authorities wanting to end Jesus' life.
And Lazarus, eventually.
Then there's a feast. Lazarus is there and is honoured. And as a result, yes, they want to kill the evidence.
Well, the evidence of Jesus having done this miracle is sort of standing, walking around, and a little hard to deny. So there's rather a lot in the Lazarus Chronicle. So we begin. And somebody says a certain man was ailing. Which is interesting, like John starts it out with a certain man, but it's only like a couple of sentences before you figure out that this isn't actually just some guy. It's someone that Jesus actually has a very close relationship with already.
And we discover his name is Lazarus. He lives in Bethany.
Which is actually today called Al-Azaria, which literally means place of Lazarus.
You can't get away from it, can you?
You really can't.
And we discover that Mary is the one having anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped his feet with her hair.
Which is a little bit interesting, again, I think, because that's, in John's Gospel, that's not till the next chapter.
But from the time when John's actually writing, he looks back, and it's all past history as far as John's concerned. So Lazarus is sick, and the sisters send to Jesus. And no mobile phones, no internet. Obviously, somebody had to travel from Bethany to where Jesus was, wherever that is.
My guess, just based on sort of putting everything together, is about a day's journey. Because when we get later on, Lazarus has been 4 days dead, and the suspicion is maybe like if he sort of died shortly after the messenger actually left Bethany, took him a day to get to Jesus. Jesus waited 2 days, travelled there, and he'd been dead 4 days. So my guess is about a day's journey.
And that's my thinking. So by the time Jesus gets the message, Lazarus is already dead.
Well, Jesus says, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep. So Jesus already knows.
But that's after the 2 days.
But yeah, it's kind of the sisters are still holding out hope, even though there's really not a lot left at this point.
And it's interesting in that bottom line there, their message is, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick.
I really find this chapter interesting because uncharacteristically for pretty much anywhere else in the Gospels, we have a lot of expressions of, affection or emotion. Like we've got here, Lord whom you love is sick. In a couple of verses, we've got, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. We don't often get that specific Jesus loved this person. We get it for John a little bit, or the disciple whom Jesus loved, but we don't actually often get this.
And we're going to get it again after the verse where Jesus wept. And the people looked and said, oh, how he loved him.
But there's 8 or 9 places in this chapter where expressions of emotion or affection or something are, and that's just not really common in the Gospels. It's the bare basics. Here's what happened. It's not, a commentary or how they felt about it, or, we don't see this much.
But this chapter has a lot of emotion.
It has a lot in it.
And having heard, Jesus said, this sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God. So that the Son of God may be glorified by it.
We kind of have a bit of a transition here. I mean, Jesus is there's almost a little bit of foreshadowing there. Some of the translations have the sickness will not end in death, which initially seems like it's a bit of a lie because he dies, but will not end is not... Death isn't always the end when Jesus is around. But we're kind of having this particular miracle is almost sort of the climax of the signs.
Well, what?
Once you've raised the dead, there's not a lot sort of up from there.
This is the ultimate sign of who he is and what he can do.
And the way that John tends to refer to, the Easter story, the Passion story, however, it's described elsewhere, it tends to be a little bit more in terms of glorified. Like, being glorified is, the process by which Jesus dies, is resurrected. That's the being raised up into glory kind of concept for John.
That's a concept that we're going to explore a little bit more as we move into some coming chapters.
And this is sort of that pivotal point. Like, we've come from a lot of signs. We get our last major I am for the book in this chapter, I think. And we're sort of at this point starting to pivot from signs into the glory narrative. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of the transition point.
And we've got the glory of God, the glorification of the Son of God, just coming at this point. Verse 5 does bring us back to that.
Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Like, it's kind of interesting for us because we have no context. It's just sort of suddenly these new characters are dumped into the story and, they're intimate friends with Jesus for some reason. We don't know how, we don't know when. Mm-hmm. But, oh, by the way, here are some people that Jesus loves.
And what I find intriguing in that verse is that he could just as easily have written, Jesus loved Martha and Mary and Lazarus. But Martha gets prominence by having her name, so does Lazarus, but her sister almost puts her into the background just a little bit. We are intrigued.
Which may be an intentional thing. I mean, we've already been told a little bit earlier on who it is, but for most of this, Martha is the one who takes the lead anyway.
But despite his love, when Jesus hears the news that Lazarus is sick, he just hangs around for a couple of days.
And I find it interesting that this therefore, like, if it was Jesus heard the news and kind of, cool, but I can't get away.
Yep.
That's one thing. But Jesus heard the news, he loved them, therefore he stayed away. That's a really interesting sort of therefore, because it doesn't feel like the kind of causality that we would expect. Like, if it's someone you love, you drop everything and go. Like, that's...
It's not what love looks like. At least not what we expect love looks like.
And I think this is a chapter in particular that's sometimes people who are, in grief have kind of come to and felt themselves in it. Like, why the waiting? There's other places where some of these thoughts are popping up, but
you almost need to experience the grief before you can experience. And it's almost like that when we come to the crucifixion as well, that Jesus could have risen the next day.
Or he could have just sort of died and like, ta-da, back, I'm done. But I think there's a couple of things at play here. Like, in this, by allowing them to experience it when it comes to his death, they already have a framework for kind of some degree of comfort, some degree of hope, that, they're not being blindsided by... to be fair, they are a little bit blindsided, but it's not for lack of warning. It's just, it hasn't connected. But there may also be kind of a layer that he can't change the consequences of sin being death. Like, it's a sinful world, the sin leads to death. Like, he can't sort of come in and change that. Now, yes, he's looking to defeat death and isn't, opposed to showing up and doing it sometimes, but he's not taking shortcuts. That you know, in a broken world with sickness, it happens, people die. He's not just sort of coming in and removing that element of choice and the, you know, how consequences flow.
And that which makes us desire something that is better. But the time comes after the 2 days, and he says to the disciples, well, you know, let's go into Judea again.
Which is kind of like, I mean, I can kind of understand the disciples here, because they're like, they were just trying to stone you and we're going back. Really?
Yeah, you're going there again. Yeah, we remember what happened last time you were there.
And to be fair, the last couple of times you were there. And like, it's got to have been a little bit weird for them, because like, you know, if you'd expect if he was going to drop everything and go, it would have been then, and just sort of tried to slip in and you know, help out. But sort of waiting 2 days and then turning up.
Just seems...
It seems a bit odd.
And Jesus' response requires a little bit of thinking about. Okay? Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him.
I mean, there's a lot, you kind of need to really sit with that and dig it. And I don't think I've really grasped it much yet. I think there's too many layers, but it seems like a really weird answer, because the disciples are like, wait, are we going to go there? Like they were just trying to kill you. Are you sure we're going there? And this doesn't seem like it's
It's almost like Jesus saying, I know what I'm doing. I can see where I'm going.
There's also kind of a sense of, you know, the night is not going to come until, you know, it's appointed time. There is still day. There are still things to do. But also a sense of, like, we've had a strong idea of, you know, his time was not yet. Mm-hmm. And I think Jesus having that sense and in some way kind of conveying that, you know, it is not yet his time, it's okay. I mean, it requires you to kind of dig in a bit, but...
And John wants us to stop and to think. But after this, he says to them, our friend, and it looks like it's not just my friend, our friend, Lazarus has fallen asleep.
Well, to be fair, if, you know, this is a family that is particularly dear and near to Jesus, then his followers are gonna know them.
Well, other Gospels tell us that Mary has sat at his feet. So, you know, the family is well known to the disciples. And he uses fallen asleep.
Which really shouldn't have been a new concept to them. Like, just sort of glancing back in Kings, particularly sort of at the end of reigns, you get, you know, in Rehoboam. And Rehoboam rested with his fathers and was buried with them in the city of David. We come on to, you know, then Asa rested with his fathers. Like, it tends to be kind of that way of...
Daniel 12, many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake.
It's not, you know, it shouldn't have been a completely new concept to any of them. Now, whether there's so much going on that they don't really have time to process it and just kind of take him on face value, I don't know, but it's there's precedent at least.
And do they have a level of grief as well?
Probably. I mean,
the story hasn't really...
They haven't found out that part of it yet.
But they certainly take it literally. He's gone to sleep, I'm going to go and wake him up.
No, if he's asleep, let him sleep. He'll get better.
If I visit someone in hospital and they're asleep, I do not wake them up.
Yes.
Sleep is good. I will leave a card. And the disciples take it that way. Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he's going to get better. He'll get well. But Jesus had used sleep as a euphemism for death. But they thought that he thought about having a night's snooze.
Every now and then I can almost picture Jesus sort of, oh, right, okay, let me make this simpler.
He does. He told them plainly, Lazarus has died. And then strangely, and I'm glad.
this is one of the ones that sort of is a bit different, because you've got these, love, but Lazarus has died, and I am glad for your sake that I was not there, so you may believe. It seems like a really, it's going to be okay, it will work out, but I am glad? Mm-hmm. Really?
And I'm glad that he does clarify. He's not glad that Lazarus has died.
Yes.
But for the sake of his disciples, he's glad that he wasn't there.
And we kind of get this. This is one of the places where Jesus is explicit about this, so you may believe. Mm-hmm. John has made it really clear that that's where he's going. But, this is Jesus actually saying it.
Are the disciples going to need to have this resurrection
fresh in their mind?
The other gospel suggests that Jesus has been repeatedly saying that he's going to Jerusalem, this is what's going to happen.
And they're just not.
They're not getting it.
And this is almost kind of emotionally preparing them for that.
That if he can raise Lazarus, there is hope and resurrection. So he then goes, but let us go to him.
I kind of almost the disciples at this point, I feel, are going to be, I don't really feel like I get it, but okay.
If he was still alive and we could maybe make him better, there'd be a point in going, but he is now dead. Why should we go to him?
And it says, let us go to him. It's not let us go to his sisters and provide, comfort or support or whatever, which would be legit, but let us go to him. But I actually kind of love the next verse as well. Thomas, we often know Thomas for, doubting. That's what we associate with him. But he can be a man of great courage as well. Okay, well, he's going to Jerusalem. Clearly, that's not going to end well.
And we're not going to change his mind.
Yeah, so we'll go with him and, we'll die too. It's kind of a not wanting to be left behind, but, this on this hill I will die kind of thing. That statement of courage.
So off they go, and having come, Jesus found him already having been 4 days in the tomb.
And this is actually, I also think, part of one of the reasons that Jesus was waiting, because there was some Jewish, or even many Jews, believe that for about 3 days, the soul remained in the body just in case, hoping that it could come back to the body. Mm-hmm. By the time he hit 4 days, it's done. He's dead. It's gone. Mm-hmm. Before 3 days, the soul is still there. It could maybe happen. So by in having it as 4 days, it is absolutely, the Jews there's a bunch of Jews have been with Mary and Martha this whole time. They saw him die. They buried him. He has been there 4 days. There is it is done.
And their culture is you bury them the day that they die, if at all possible, even to this day.
And so you've got this absolute, you can't just kind of, well, maybe he just came back to life because he hadn't fully died or something. It is absolute. There is no questions here.
And the way they wrapped them up, if they weren't dead before they wrapped them.
Yes, they would be after.
And we discovered that Bethany is actually near Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. And in fact, we've chucked a map in here with Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem there. It's now sprawled much bigger. It's only about 3 kilometres as the crow flies across to Bethany, which is, what was that word you called it?
Lazaria, place of Lazarus, which is its legal name now.
So really, there's not too much distance from it. Mm. Many of the Jews had come, and we're assuming they maybe have come from Jerusalem. Mm.
Well, 3K is kind of a
other side of
half an hour walk kind of thing.
Yes. And they're there to console them concerning their brother. Obviously, somebody has picked up that Jesus is on the edge of town.
To be fair, I think a lot of Jesus's travels, they're he can't really sneak into town. There is
Somebody saying, Jesus is coming.
it's sort of, oh, there's someone, oh, it's Jesus, like pass it on. And like, just the, it's very visible a lot of the time when he's around. Like he can slip out of the crowd if he needs to, but he doesn't generally tend to sneak in.
Mm-hmm. And Martha, when she hears that Jesus is coming, meets him. So she gets up, she actually meets Jesus on the edge of town.
Which, she's sort of the older sister. It's almost a hostess kind of thing. Like, even through her grief, she's, doing her sisterly duty, getting up and greeting him, welcoming him in, even if she maybe doesn't really feel like it at that point.
Mary doesn't feel like doing anything.
And Mary just, no, I'm staying.
And Martha gets there, she knows, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died.
And I think that's a question that a lot of people who deal with grief have to really grapple with. Like, you could have done something and my loved one would still be here. Why didn't you do something?
And they pray and nothing happens.
Like in this case, like Jesus is physically there, not far away, that he could have come back and done something.
Oh, he could work a miracle at a distance.
Yeah, he could have just kind of thought and ta-da, he's better again. And we kind of have this sense of it being a bit of a conditional thing. Like, if you love, you help. You don't sort of love someone and leave them when they're suffering. Like to us, that doesn't seem like a very loving way to respond.
I wonder what she thought afterwards. And it's interesting, a little bit later on, Mary is going to ask the same question.
The exact same question. And I mean, you can understand that this is the question at the top of their minds. But I also find it really interesting to see the different ways that Jesus responds to the exact same question. Mm-hmm. That he's asked the same question or, the same basic statement. And he responds with Martha and Mary in a very different way.
And Martha obviously still has that skerrick of hope.
Mm.
Yeah? Even now I know that whatever you might ask God, God will give you.
It's kind of an interesting statement, I think, because come down a couple of sentences and, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Like, it kind of almost sounds like she's holding out hope, but she doesn't,
It's not immediate hope.
It's not immediate hope.
But Jesus has said your brother will rise again.
But, I mean, it could...
It's generic.
It's generic. It could also feel like one of those sort of, comforting platitude kind of things, like, there, he'll, at the resurrection, he'll rise again and it will be fine. Once you get to heaven, everything will be great. And she's like, yeah, I know all that.
Well,
I have faith in that.
She could have got that just from listening to Jesus and, 4 times he said, and I will raise him up on the last day.
Mm.
So
she's been paying attention.
She's been, and it's also there in the Old Testament.
Mm.
Job, I know that my Redeemer liveth and he will stand upon the earth in the latter day. Though worms destroy my body, yet in my flesh shall I see God.
A lot of what Jesus is doing in his teaching is kind of connecting all these dots and making them make a lot more sense, because a lot of this stuff isn't new. It's just that the way Jesus is sort of synthesizing it and explaining it and revealing God through it kind of tells you more than they'd had before, even though they had all the basic imagery and information ahead of time.
And so Jesus says to her, I am. There's that expression we've noticed multiple times through John's Gospel. And on this occasion, it's I am the resurrection and the life. I
find it kind of interesting in that, it's not I bring resurrection or, I give resurrection. It's I am resurrection. It is embodiment. It is identity.
In him is life.
Mm. But, particularly the second half of it, that resurrection is very much tied up with believing in him.
Which is something John's going to push in this gospel, but also in his letter.
Mm.
He who has the Son has life. He who doesn't have the Son doesn't have life. Well, John 3.
Mm. this is not a new concept. John's been on this hobby horse for a little while. But like this is sort of the moment where it really gets almost codified.
The one believing in me, even if he should die, he will live.
That this death is not, permanent as a concept, but that it is believing in him and resurrection are kind of, parts of the same identity, that they can't be separated.
One with the other.
Yeah.
Everyone living and believing in me shall never die to the age. Do you believe this?
Which I find is kind of interesting because, she is clearly grieving. Mm-hmm. Jesus seems to be, from the outside offering an awkward theological nerd kind of hope. I know you're experiencing emotions and stuff, but let's have a theological discussion about resurrection. And on the outside, it kind of seems like a weird approach.
But maybe that was
what she needed.
And he knew Martha well enough to know.
No.
She needed the sort of concrete.
And also, he's calling her to affirm to herself. She responds, yes, Lord, I have believed that you are the Christ, the Son of God, the one coming into the world.
A triple affirmation.
And it there's a reaffirmation of almost a recentering of herself and her belief. And yes, I know it's going to be okay. I believe in you.
Mm-hmm. And so in her grief, she has this peace, the Messiah, the Son of God, the one sent from the Father. She has hope.
And even if I don't necessarily understand now why I have to be in this grief and why you couldn't do something, I know that ultimately it's going to be okay because,
You are.
You are. And, clearly we know from the beginning of this chapter that she knows she's loved by Jesus and everyone else knows she's loved by Jesus. There's no question there.
And it's almost a play-off. Jesus has had an I am, and now she has got a you are response to him. Having said this, she runs off and calls Mary. Almost looks like she whispered in her ear, the teacher has come and he calls you.
There's a really tiny just sort of note here that I find interesting in that Martha calls him the teacher. Mm-hmm. Rabbis at that time did not teach girls. Did not teach girls. And for these girls, these women to both call him the teacher or understand him as the teacher, kind of suggests that he is actually being more than willing to teach them.
Well, we did have the story in one of the other Gospels where Martha said to Jesus, would you tell her to help me?
Yes. But this is Martha saying the teacher has come. It's not just sort of, Mary kind of distracted from her chores and but this is really cool. I want to listen to this. This is Martha calling him the teacher. Mm-hmm. I feel like there's some character development that we don't necessarily see, but...
And Mary, when she hears, gets up quickly and's on her way. Mm. And Jesus is still some way out.
And to me, there's kind of almost a sense of Mary is probably going to have found out at the same time as Martha did that Jesus was coming. Mm-hmm. And Mary's just I don't want to deal with the world right now. But at the point where Martha comes and says, the teacher's come and he calls you, it almost kind of gives Mary that, yes, he didn't come when you wanted him to, but he still cares.
And there's so much about Lazarus, Mary, Martha that we don't understand. Were they orphans? The fact that here we have...
3 siblings essentially living together as adults.
Yeah. Was she the youngest? It would appear that it could be the case.
We think Martha was the older sister.
What is her loss history? Does she have a history of losing parents?
And there's a lot of those questions that we just don't have answers for in these kind of stories because the gospel writers don't feel that's necessary. But you can kind of put yourself, Like, if you take some time and use a bit of biblical imagination to sort of enter into these stories, you can kind of start feeling some of the things that might be impacting this story.
So Mary's on her way out, and the Jews who were with her in the house and trying to console her.
There was kind of this system that, when somebody died, you had like 3 or 4 days of very heavy grieving, followed by 3 or 4 days of kind of heavy grieving. And then like sort of most people go home, but there's another sort of month or two of sort of moderate to light grieving. And so, 4 days in, we're sort of in that transition between very heavy grieving and heavy grieving. And, then her sort of quickly hopping up and going out, they're being good emotional support people, like she might be headed for the tomb, we should go. Mm-hmm. And so...
Obviously she had been there to weep before. That's what they anticipated would happen. But Mary, when she comes to where Jesus was, having seen him, falls at his feet, saying to him, and I think the tone of voice might be different, though the words are the same. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died.
He doesn't really say anything much to her.
He doesn't.
Like the weeping that her and the Jews, like the word for weeping is a loud wailing kind of grief. Now, when we get to Jesus in a verse or two, it's not that loud, it's quiet. But Jesus sort of pays attention to the emotional situation going on around him.
She's not in a fit state to have an intellectual discussion about it.
It's really not. And was deeply moved. It's another one of these times where we get an emotional expression from Jesus. That
just lock that deeply moved in. We're going to see it again.
And just sort of troubled is also the word that John uses for the Gethsemane kind of moment. So that there's sort of almost a deep agony. Mm-hmm. Like, that he's not sort of, chill, I'm going to fix this, it's going to be fine. He's engaging in the emotions. He's being there with her in her grief.
I haven't done the research, but I wonder if that's the word that's used, let not your hearts be troubled.
Probably.
There's one to pursue.
That's in a couple of chapters. We'll check up on that.
We'll check up on that one. And the heaviest question he asks is, where have you laid him? Where's he buried? Which,
for everybody around is going to seem like that I made to go and, grieve at his, like he's clearly emotionally affected, asking to go to his grave.
So Jesus himself has emotion.
Yes. And this is one of the things that I think can be a little bit hard to see sometimes in the Gospels, because you're hearing about what Jesus says and what Jesus does. But here we kind of get this glimpse at Jesus, being really fully human, at having emotions, at experiencing grief at the loss of his friend. Even though he knew what he was going to do, he still felt the feelings.
In fact, Jesus had tear ducts and knew how to use them. He wept. Which,
there's kind of, in our idea of masculinity, this is not like... Okay, slightly toxic idea of masculinity, but real men don't cry. Well, I think just Jesus being willing to enter into his emotions like this, like it wasn't the wailing grief that everybody else was doing, but, it was sort of a quiet grief that he was emotionally affected by this. He cared. And, he wasn't just sort of staring at Mary who was crying going, make it stop. The crying makes me uncomfortable. Please make it stop.
And that's very often the problem when people are grieving. It makes those around them feel uncomfortable.
Yes, and we want the grieving to stop because I feel uncomfortable, so please make it stop, rather than being willing to actually enter into those messy, hard feelings with them.
Mm-hmm. But as a result, the Jews were saying, behold, how he loved him.
Again, it's one of the things I love about this chapter is that, it's not just Jesus going around and doing things. It's not just, Jesus showing that he loves by the way that he does things. Here he is, Mary is weeping, Jesus is weeping with her.
Other people are probably weeping along.
And the Jews, their reaction to this is they see it, they watch it, they go, this guy really mattered to Jesus. Like, it's not just they're there kind of.
In fact, people matter to Jesus, and we're going to notice a little bit further on that there's another group of people for whom people don't matter. But interestingly, we've got the Jews saying, look how he loved him, but some of them.
You've got a lot of, it's kind of a Johnism here, these Jews, but some.
Or some, but others.
Yeah, but kind of you've got this sort of parallel here that, some Jews are seeing Jesus grieving with her and going, see how he loved him, which, again, heavy emotional content in this one. I'm liking this, emotions using Jesus. But you've also got kind of some of them who, legitimately are saying, well, I mean, if he really likes this guy, there's plenty of other guys plenty of other people he met like once who he healed and helped.
Well, he opened the eyes of the blind. Couldn't he have caused this one not have died? Well, the answer is yes, he could have.
It's a legit question. And
yes.
Yeah, he could have. And again, that sort of like, how you love him, but therefore not act is something that they're kind of grappling with as well.
And they're not realising there's something even bigger in the pipeline.
To be fair, that's very human though.
But the next response, we go right back to Jesus being deeply moved in himself. Again. That it's not just he came, he had a little weep and said,
okay, good to go.
And it seems like it's as he comes to the tomb. It's a cave, there's a stone rolled in front of it.
And I kind of feel like, for Jesus, this is an emotionally tangled moment because he knows what he's about to do. But at the same time, there's also the very human grief at losing someone he's loved. He's surrounded by a bunch of people who are really quite also emotional, who don't understand what's coming. But this is not unlike a tomb that he's going to know in a little while. Like
in a very intimate way.
There's layers of emotional complication here for Jesus. And yes, I think a lot of the deeply moved is to do with his friend just died. And he loves these people and they're grieving and it's tied up in that.
He's grieving right along.
But I think that layer of
anticipation, what's coming his way.
And that he's kind of facing that alone because at the moment, none of his disciples get it. Like he doesn't have anybody to sort of console him or be there for him in his grief at this coming.
But there is one who's getting it.
Yes, sort of slowly, sort of.
And so he says to them, take away the stone.
This is the point which, wait, what? If you come, if you go and visit the grave of a friend who's died, you visit, pay your respects. You don't say take the lid off.
Or dig him up.
It's not really the done thing,
And over there, no refrigeration. Martha is very clear about the decomposition odours that are going to emit.
She's very practical, Martha.
She knows that it's been 4 days. She's been around. And Jesus has to say to her, did I not say to you, if you should believe, does she believe?
She's already sort of
affirmed that.
Affirmed that.
If you should believe, you will see the glory of God.
I think this is another one of these now but not yet things that the other Gospels aren't quite so specific on this, but I think she's been assuming that this is a not yet. I believe and eventually I will see. I will see. And Jesus is kind of like, no, the last day is also kind of the now. Yes, resurrection isn't typically a now thing, but this is a now one.
So they had a level of faith. They took away the stone.
I kind of find it interesting because there's all sorts of degrees of unclean and that are coming in. You've got the smell, you've got the if you've got the grieving sisters, they've laid him to rest, they're grieving it, they're getting over it, don't open it again. You've got the, getting near him or touching anything to do with him is going to have unclean ramifications. There's a lot here.
Mm-hmm. You're not meant to mess with these things. And Jesus lifts his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you've heard me. I know that you always hear me. I didn't need to say it, but I say it on account of the crowd standing around.
Which, kind of an odd little prayer there. But I see what he's getting at, but it's almost a demonstrative prayer rather than a...
Yeah, this is for the hearers, that they may believe that you sent me.
Again, we've got Jesus starting to really infer and push this home.
And this is John's whole theme. These are written that you may believe, and believing may have life in his name. And having said these things, he cries out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. And the one having been dead...
I kind of find it interesting here that John references him this way. It's not, Lazarus walked out. It's the one who was dead walked out.
Okay. The feet, the hand being bound with linen strips, his face.
To be fair, I feel like it was less of walking, more kind of a waddling, because that...
Very much a shuffle.
Yes.
Because there was a lot of wrapping and all the stuff that they put around was almost like glue.
And you don't have Jesus kind of like, ta-da, he's just unbind him and allow him to go. It's done.
He's not going anywhere fast without being unbound.
Yes, he's not.
Whereas he could have brought him out just in one piece, but instead...
There's sort of this element here that can be sort of a little bit missed. Mm-hmm. Because, we have Jesus saying, take away the stone. We have Jesus saying, unbind him and allow him to go. I mean, if you're bringing someone back to life...
Rolling
the stone away and, poofing the stuff that he was wrapped in so the dude could actually walk isn't that much of a leap. Bringing back to life is clearly the harder thing here. But he's involving the people around him in the miracle that what humans can do, they should do. It's not just a sort of sitting around helplessly waiting for God to do all the things. It's what humans can do to, alleviate grief, to be involved in these miracles. What humans can do, they should be doing.
And what they can't do is God's part.
Is God's problem. I kind of almost wish we'd had a little bit of it, John's given us some teasers and emotion here, just a little bit. What was it like when sort of, Lazarus was family unbound and there could be a big family hug and
I bet there was.
We sort of switched to the crowd at this point. Okay, maybe John's giving them sort of a bit of a private moment together, but at this point we sort of switched to the crowd and it's all on their reactions.
Mm-hmm. And these are the ones who have come to support Mary. It's interesting that it's only Mary that's picked on. It's almost like she's got more community friends than...
I kind of sense that she's maybe also the one a little bit more willing to be open about grief and needs and that, she's Martha's very responsible, she's practical, and she's grieving, but, there's all the affairs that have to be dealt with. Whereas Mary, I just kind of feels like she's lost in her grief.
And is letting herself grieve. Mm. But these people, this is not done in a corner.
No.
They have come to the tomb with them, having seen what he did, believed in him.
I kind of find it interesting, yes, this is a Johnism, but we've got, therefore many of the Jews. Mm-hmm. But some, he has raised a man to life in front of you. What does it take? What more does he have to do? And we kind of, there's some people sort of seem to have this, I need more evidence, but often it's not more evidence because you've got people here who have literally seen a man raised to life in front of them, a man that they knew, a man that they had seen die, that they had put in the grave, that they had seen, been with the sisters grieving. It was well and truly past that this could happen. They have seen him raised from the dead. There is never any question anywhere that it happened. at all.
And it shouldn't have been a problem to the Pharisees because they believed in resurrection at the last day.
Sadducees, not so much, but like nowhere in any of this is there any question as to whether the raising of someone from the dead happened.
It's more, what are the implications of this? And so we have the chief priests and the Pharisees holding a council.
We're starting to get into the sort of, higher echelons of the Jewish hierarchy with this kind of a council.
Yeah. This man does many signs. If we let him alone like this, all will believe in him.
They're kind of just looking forward and saying, okay, this there is no stopping this at this point. He can raise people from the dead.
And the Romans will come. I'm really not sure why the Romans would be too concerned, but
I think that some of that comes from, like in post-exile, when they were allowed to come back, it was sort of very conditional. Like, you can come back, you can have your land, you can kind of operate under your own functions and laws and whatnot, but you're still under the realm of Rome. And if we kind of get a hint that, you're starting to sort of, rise up against us, or you're getting a little bit too big for your britches, we will come in and we will deal with you. And
they did a little bit later on.
Yes. So clearly it didn't save them. But I suspect that's kind of behind these have been the people who have been responsible for, the peace and the, being able to maintain order and protect their people in this space. And this young upstart dude is kind of just throwing all of the religious and political structures into disarray at this point.
Yeah, what are their options? And so we're actually meeting a group of people that are going to feature prominently in the rest of this gospel.
And we've sort of had them popping up a little bit here and there throughout the gospel, but it's sort of just been this indeterminate, chief priests, Pharisees, the Jews, kind of, it's not really...
But now we're having council meetings.
So, the power is starting to actually kind of congregate and plot.
And so maybe we need just to explore them for a moment.
And I think this is sort of particularly key in that, we're starting to head into the part of the story where these guys become a big part of the story. But we've sort of, the main kind of upper body is the Sanhedrin, which had a chief priest, which at this point at least was a Sadducee. I don't know if that was always the case, but at this point the chief priest is a Sadducee. And
well into the book of Acts, it's Sadducees plus Pharisees, and they didn't always get on.
Oh, plenty didn't get on. But the Sadducees sort of tended to be the higher ruling elite aristocracy kind of end of things.
Maintaining the power.
So you had your chief priest, a vice chief justice, and then 69 general members, which was made up of a combination of Sadducees and Pharisees. So the Sadducees tended to be kind of the higher levels of power. It was their role to be upholding all the traditional beliefs and practices, the temple sacrifices, all those kind of things. Their power was very much in the temple. Whereas the Pharisees, the power was a little bit more kind of the synagogues. The Pharisees were very much more bringing the Jewish religious life and, principles and the purity and the laws and that into everyday lives, into synagogues, into homes, into, your everyday life and practice. So they were kind of bringing it very much more into the people.
They grew out of the Maccabean revolt. And a lot of the people had fallen away and had been happy to accept what the Greeks were offering, and they stood up and they resisted them.
And this is consistent, even, 70 years later when we have the destruction of Jerusalem, it's the Pharisees who are kind of, working hard to maintain, and they put together the Mishnah, which is the way that, we know a lot about the maintaining of the Jewish traditions after the destruction of the temple, is because it's the Pharisees who were, we kind of can sometimes see them as the bad guys, but they were working really hard to help. The continuing interpretation of the Torah, that it was a thing to be continually sort of worked through and understood and interpret. Now, Jesus is clearly throwing a spanner in those works.
It's very hard in a situation like that to bring in some new teaching.
And, for the Sadducees are very much more kind of heavily literal. Like, for the Sadducees, there was no resurrection because it never mentioned it in the Torah, so therefore, that's it. They were a lot more friendlier with Rome. There was sort of that negotiation with power.
Whereas the Pharisees had bad history with secular foreign governments.
Like, even with the Pharisees, there was almost a degree of democracy in it. Like, they were very much sort of working for the common people. They also gave sort of the oral tradition equal status with Scripture. And so that's one of the places where Jesus butts heads with them a little bit, because the oral tradition was sometimes outweighing the Scripture itself, and in some ways twisting it. So that was some sort of the source of conflict. But Jesus turning up and claiming to be God was clearly problematic for both groups.
And at this point, we have a council meeting.
Yeah. They're getting together. When the two groups are starting to get together, serious things are happening.
And they're even willing to compromise certain values in order to get their way. And one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said, and it's almost like a put down, you know nothing at all.
It is a little bit rude. This is the group of the body of people that are responsible for legislating and enforcing and, interpreting and understanding these are the smart ones. And Caiaphas stands up and says, you know nothing at all. Now, just as a note, Caiaphas was a Sadducee. Sadducees were kind of known a little bit to not necessarily be polite.
It's a little bit of arrogance there.
Josephus talks about them a little bit and seems to indicate that they're known to be kind of rude. And not, this isn't uncharacteristic.
But he's got something to say. Don't you consider that it's profitable for you that one man should die for the people and the whole nation should not perish? There's a simple solution to this problem.
I love the note that John gives us on this, though. Because, he did not say this from himself, but being high priest that year, he prophesied Jesus was about to die for the nation.
If God can speak through Balaam's donkey, I guess the high priest will
He can manage a high priest as well. And kind of on a level that he didn't understand how true his words were, but, it was kind of marching on in that direction that it had to go anyway.
And, John commentates, Jesus was about to die for the nation.
But not for the nation only, but also the children of God, those having been scattered, he might gather into one. So this is not just
the seed.
These people. He's been planting a little bit of seeds all the way through, that this isn't just for you guys, but we're starting to get it's popping up with more frequency now.
And so from that day, they took counsel together. They might kill him. Apparently killing's not one of the commandments. And so Jesus no longer walked publicly among the Jews, but went away from there into the region near the wilderness to a city called Ephraim. And there he stayed with the disciples.
We've again got that sense that it's not yet his time, that, he would die for others as prophesied by the high priest in his time, but in his time, not theirs.
And so we get another little time code popped in. The Passover of the Jews is near. Another year has rolled around. Many went up to Jerusalem out of the region before the Passover so that they might purify themselves. It's not a strong comparison, but it's a little bit like quarantine. You have to get there a little bit early so you can do all the things so that they're all done in time and you're free to, you've done the purification and you're good to go by the time that the feast itself rolls around. So you have to turn up early and do all the things. And when they get there, they're looking for Jesus. And they were saying to one another standing in the temple, what's it seem to you that he won't come to the feast?
But to be fair, the very next sentence is, the chief priests and the Pharisees had given a command. This is no longer like just in the inner circles. This is a command. If anybody knows where he is, tell us so we can take him. I think most people are going to either go, no, I can maybe understand why he's lying low this year. But, it's known. The word has been put out. If anybody knows where he is, tell us.
However, 6 days before the Passover,
Jesus came back to
Bethany.
Alazaria.
Okay. This village of Lazarus, where Lazarus was, whom he had raised from the dead. We're still on that story. And they made a supper there.
To be fair, if you've been raised from the dead, that's probably what you're going to be famous for. It's not going to be like Lazarus who makes amazing bread. It's going to be, the dude who died and was raised to life again. Like, this is going to be part of his identity.
And the other
always.
two Gospels says that it was at the house of Simon the leper, who had also had an experience with Jesus. Martha's part of the catering team.
Mary's probably supposed to be part of the catering team. I mean, it's clearly a guess, but just by the way that Mary and Martha worked, to me it feels like this is another one of those times that Martha is doing what she should be doing and Mary was sort of doing what she should be doing and then wasn't doing what she should be doing.
And Lazarus is honoured guest, I imagine. But Mary takes this half a litre, it's called a litre, of fragrant oil, of pure nard.
That stuff is strong. Like, there is no tiptoeing in the room and opening this up. Once you open this up, everybody in the room is going to know.
And she anoints his feet, wipes his feet with her hair, and the understatement of the verse, the whole house was filled with the fragrance of the oil.
Probably was for weeks.
I have a feeling that when Jesus was crucified,
he could still smell it. And I think that isn't unintentional. She may not necessarily have known what she was doing, but the events sort of being woven together as they are. Like, you've got this ever so slight fragrance of Mary's love lingering.
And it's maybe to do with her thankfulness for Lazarus's.
We don't kind of fully know her story. I think there's more to it, but there's a lot of Marys mentioned and we're not completely sure which ones line up and which ones don't. But my suspicion is particularly that we start chapter 11 with, that this is a family that is already very treasured by Jesus, that there is a long history of things here.
And if you just raised a brother, you're going to be much more treasured.
Yes.
But it doesn't go down well. All three Gospels say Judas Iscariot, one of the disciples being about to betray him, says, why was this fragrant oil not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?
Kind of find it, all of the Gospels almost seem to have a bit of a grudge against, yes, okay, Judas did what he did, but there's no sort of, no leeway given to him. Like, it's Judas Iscariot, the dude who was about to do something bad. That dude, that's the guy that's talking. It's not, Judas did a thing. It's Judas, the bad guy who was about to do the thing.
And John has a little commentary here as well. He didn't say this because he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief. He had the money bag, he used to pilfer what was being put into it.
Again, I think this is a past note. That they worked out later, because if they'd known ahead of time, he probably wouldn't have been in charge of the bag. But it kind of I almost wonder whether at this, when they figured out what he had done or what he was going to do or whatever it was, whether they sort of started comparing notes and figuring out, could we have seen this coming, and seeing if there was other clues that he was up to no good.
For Jesus is protective of Mary.
He's protective of Mary, but it's not long he's going to be protective of Judas as well.
Yeah. And Jesus' words are, leave her alone, so that for the day of my burial, she may keep it. It's interesting, Mary's going to be there at that as well. You will always have the poor with you. You have a responsibility to the poor, but not always do you have me.
Just that there is one note that does need to be made, that this sentence is often really badly quoted out of context to imply that, like, the poor are always going to be with you. So, I mean, they're always going to be there. Why bother trying? That this is a justification for not doing anything for the poor because the poor are always going to be there. That's already been said. So, I mean, we can't change that. And I mean, if you're reading in context any of it, that's not an adequate or accurate reading. But this verse is often really badly misquoted in that way.
And that they are there for us to deal with.
There's kind of this, it's been done in a few ways, but sort of a cartoon or a meme where you've got, you know, somebody complaining to Jesus, you know, if you're so good, why are there people suffering? Why is, you know, the world such a horrible place? Why don't you do something? And Jesus is kind of, I was about to ask you the same thing. That, you know, there is a responsibility there.
God doesn't do that which we can and ought to be doing ourselves.
And there's sort of, you know, it comes with a responsibility that it's not just kind of carry on your own way and keep your own, you know, maintain your own traditions and safety and comfort levels, that there is a, you know, the poor are always going to be with you, yes, but that doesn't mean you don't try.
Well, it's a little bit like the term, there's a crowd. They know Jesus is there. And they came not only because of Jesus, but also that they might see Lazarus, who he had raised from the dead.
I mean, to be fair, if these, like, social media and, like, magazines and stuff had been in existence, Lazarus probably would have been front paging at this point. Like, as far as people coming to gawk, yep, Lazarus is going to be the talk of the, whether he wants it or not.
He is the evidence that dead people
don't always stay dead.
don't stay dead necessarily.
Which is a problem for the priests.
Because the evidence against them is walking and talking.
Probably quite a lot at this point. And everybody else is talking about it. And, like, you know, it's really hard to put this cat back in the bag.
So what do? You couldn't possibly believe that Jesus is the Son of God, the one sent of the Father. You have to bury the evidence. So they took counsel that they might kill Lazarus also. That's keeping the law, isn't it? Yeah.
But it also kind of amuses me that, you know, we've got clearly the chief priests in this case. So the chief priests are Sadducees. There's never any question that Lazarus was raised from the dead, even though the Sadducees do not believe in resurrection. So the chief priests don't believe that this thing can happen, but this thing happened.
People have seen it and
kill it? Like, what do we do?
Because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and were believing in Jesus. There is a groundswell of
support towards him.
Support toward Jesus. Because who else can do this? Which is where John's Gospel wants us to take it. Here is a groundswell of people believing in Jesus, and in the next episode, they are going to have their day in the parade.
It all begins.
It all begins, and we're going to continue on next week in chapter 12. Read along with us, read behind us, read in front of us as we continue to explore the Gospel of John and who Jesus is. God bless.